North Carolina Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped welcomes you to Spies in Plain Sight. I'm Catherine Rubin, the Assistant Regional Librarian. This is the first in a three-part series called History's Mysteries that library patron Bill Stepien will present for us this year. Today, he will talk about Spies in Plain Sight, female spies throughout history. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to introduce Timothy Owens, State Librarian for the state of North Carolina.
Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of the State Library of North Carolina. So glad you could join us this afternoon for the first in this series of presentations. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Catherine Rubin and Clint Exum for their work in organizing this series. And I hope you all enjoy the presentation and will join us for the two subsequent events in this series. And also I'd encourage you, if you don't have a library card with the Government and Heritage Library at the State Library, I'd encourage you to sign up for one of those where you can access a number of online resources and maybe even dig deeper into some of the stories you'll hear today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Thank you, Timothy. So now a few housekeeping matters. Please note that this program will be recorded in video and audio. And after Bill's presentation on this intriguing topic, it's likely that you'll want to find out more about female spies. For further information, a resource list of North Carolina Library for the Blind audio resources and online resources available through the State Library of North Carolina will be posted online following the program. If you are a National Library Service patron and want the list in an alternative format, please contact us. Bill will be presenting PowerPoint slides, but he will also describe them for the audience. You will be muted when the program starts, so we won't get background noises like phones ringing or dogs barking. If you have a question, please raise your hand and you will be unmuted when it's your turn to ask your question. You can raise your hand physically with a question or select the Zoom raise hand option for a question, or type the question in the chat box at any time by clicking the chat option in the bottom middle of the Zoom screen. If you're calling by an old-fashioned landline phone, not a smartphone loaded with Zoom, use *6 to mute or unmute yourself. Use *9 to raise your hand to ask a question. Sarah Brackett and Clint Exum will be monitoring any Zoom questions. We're so fortunate to have Bill Stepien with us today. For more than 50 years, Bill has been a history teacher, writer, educational consultant, and storyteller. He taught history in middle and high schools in both Illinois and North Carolina. While teaching, Bill was an author for a K-7 social studies series and a popular Illinois state history book. As founder of Human Learning Resources Incorporated, Bill trained teachers across the U.S. in ways to help their students develop critical thinking skills. For the past 3 years, Mr. Stepien has been blending a storytelling style with history topics through a program titled History's Mysteries to help history come alive again for adult audiences. And he really does a superb job. Bill is not a stranger to the North Carolina Library for the Blind. He's been a patron for more than 10 years, often using the library to research topics for his presentations. So Bill, I'll hand it on to you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. It's a joy to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting us. I say us because the other half of the team is with me today too. It's my wife, Abby, and I'll ask her to kind of lean in here and smile and wave.
Everyone.
She's the better looking part of the team, that's for sure. We form a great team because both of us are very interested in digging deep into history, to discovering, to probing, to looking for connections that we don't find on the page of history textbooks. And that takes me back to my many, many years in the classroom. Catherine said 50. I'd forgotten it was quite that long. The scars are pretty much healed by this time. But during those years, it was very curious. In fact, the first couple of years, I went into the history classroom the same way I'd come out of the college classroom, listening to lectures and being prepared to lecture and tell people about what they needed to know about history. And then I got into the public schools and I found a very interesting situation. In front of me, the principal had placed a curriculum guide for the state curriculum in Illinois, where I started. And what I noticed immediately was that as I went from page to page, they were outlining in the book just how many days, even sometimes how many hours I had on the topic. So I would get something like the New Deal, and it would say, you have 45 minutes. You have one class period. Well, what was I to do with young people who had to learn or we hope would learn about that kind of legislation called the New Deal? I'd have to talk and talk and talk and then give a quiz and then see if they got it. If not, I would talk differently to the next class to see if they would get it. And you know what I found out is that's just not the way to encounter history. So after a couple of years, it became pretty clear that my kids, my students, would rather dig in, explore, probe, find connections between things, and they'd like to do some of that on their own. And so the style that we began to develop back in the 60s and 70s was something called inquiry. And we were working as educators in Illinois and then across the country to find those ways to bring kids to history so they could discover something in depth now and then, rather than just surveying stuff and going quickly from topic to topic. Most kids would rather do the inquiry. They would rather do the discovery learning than they would to sit and listen to any teacher, no matter how great their voice was or how deep they understood the topic. And so years later, when Abby and I were preparing for my retirement, especially from education, we started talking about, wouldn't adults enjoy doing something very similar? Wouldn't they like to take a topic periodically and not be rushed through it, but to go down into it and see some of the unusual, maybe even mysterious stuff that would be connected to that topic, and enjoy chatting about it and you know, taking some time to look into it? How better can we develop a sense of history and a sense of what history means and what society means to us today? The best way, it's to discover it. It's to probe it. It's to see what it's all about. And so that's what we brought to adult groups in the Charlotte area. We work with a number of organizations, with the Mecklenburg Library System, as Catherine pointed out too. And now we're so delighted to be able to talk with people in so many diverse places and so many places across the country. So welcome everybody. That's what we're about. And the topic we chose for today, spies in plain sight, it's got all of those things in it that I just talked about. It's got stuff hidden under the surface. Well, we're talking about spies, of course. There's going to be stuff hidden under the surface. And we're going to probe some stuff. We're going to discover some stuff. We're going to see where our deep dive into this topic takes us. And then we're going to see how we can tie together under this idea that spies, that to be effective, have to be in plain sight. And so let's get started with this particular topic. I love the eyes of this person in our opening screen there, and the shawl across her face, kind of symbolic of hiding but still being in plain sight. So, what do spies do? Well, James Bond over here in the corner is often what we have in our mind when we talk about the spy trade or spycraft. But what are spies really up to? Not just putting on their bow tie and going to to fancy restaurants and so forth. They really, their job is to gather information. Information that someone doesn't necessarily want you to have. And so, how do spies do that? Well, they have to have access to that information. So, they have to find a way or ways to get to it in the best manner possible. They avoid being noticed. If they're noticed, if they're caught, it's a danger to them, but it also destroys sources of information. And so spies have to avoid being noticed, which means they have to be able to move about unnoticed to those sources of information that are critical to whatever the cause might be. And they should be able to hide in plain sight. In that way, they can get those two things above them. Now, hiding in plain sight, you notice on the screen, I put up there women, okay? Stereotypically, women have not been prominent in the events of a political movement, in the events of cultural movements, until very recently in our history. So lo and behold, women spies could pull off the idea of spying in plain sight better than males could. And we'll take a peek at a number of examples of that as we go through our program. So what about spycraft? Let's go back to the beginning, sort of. On our left-hand panel there, we have a picture of Joshua and Caleb from the Old Testament. You remember the old story, or maybe you don't, but Moses sent a chieftain from each of the 12 tribes into Canaan to take a look at the situation. What could be grown in Canaan? What was the politics like? Were there soldiers? Were there people we had to be careful of? How receptive would Canaan be to us? And he asked each of the chieftains to come back with a report, 12 different reports. 10 came back negative. Joshua and Caleb came back with fruit. They came back with great reports and said, this place is ready for us. But of course, Moses, based on a 10-2 vote, said, we're not going to go in now. Let's wander around for a little bit longer. So we've got a good example of two spies right there bringing information back about the land of Canaan. Now, on the right-hand screen, you see another couple of characters from way back in the beginning. That would be Samson and Delilah, better known as Hedy Lamarr and Victor Mature in 1949 film by Cecil B. DeMille. And you remember that Delilah played her role so extremely well. She was beautiful and charming and witty, and wound up cutting off the hair of Samson when she learned that was the source of his strength. But here she was, a spy. She was very deceiving in her role, and she got what she was out to get at that time. But let's come up a little more recent than that. Let's move up to the Revolutionary War. In the formation of our country, spies played a major role. And probably the most notorious of the group of spies at that time, and the most productive, certainly if you look back over the history of the Revolutionary War and Revolutionary period, was a group of people called the Culper Ring. That's what they named themselves. That, of course, was a secretive name. And the Culper Ring was formed around the New York City area, which was the center of the British forces in the colonies after the war broke out. The British were in Philadelphia for a while, but then moved back into New York City in force when the threat of the French entering the war became very prominent. Now, the Culper Ring was put together or involved a number of people, a fairly small cadre, but their reach was quite deep. So Washington, in needing to have good spies, needing to have a good spy network, because the British were outgunning us in the spy business, he asked a cavalry officer by the name of Benjamin Talmadge to get some people together he could trust and who could also gather information from the British. So Talmadge asked Robert Townsend, a merchant in New York City, who was in an interesting situation. You talk about a spy in plain sight. Townsend was the owner of a clothing store frequented by British officers. So he had the ability and the opportunity to listen to conversation in his store and engage in conversation. The officers liked Townsend. Townsend gave them great treatment in the store, and there was quite a bit of conversation. And you know the old adage, loose lips. And so Townsend would gather information. He was also very popular in the coffee houses of New York City. So he would go around and he would listen, he would get involved in conversations, and when he had information, he would send it back via a tavern owner from the town of Setauket, Long Island. Okay, that fellow was Austin Rowe. Austin Rowe would go from Setauket into New York City with his wagon to get supplies for his tavern back in Setauket. Okay, he would take information from Mr. Townsend back with him, and he would give it to Abraham Woodall. Woodall was a farmer who had a farm right along the edges of Long Island Sound. Okay, on our map, that'll be down towards the bottom of the map, you'll see a line going across Long Island Sound. On the other side of the sound is Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut, most specifically. Now, on the northern side of Long Island Sound was the camp of George Washington and the colonial troops. On the other side, the south side, on Long Island, in Setauket, we had the Loyalist stronghold. And so we had Loyalists controlling Setauket, or George Washington on the northern side, needing information. How would it get over there? Well, Mr. Woodall, the farmer, had 5 or 6 sites along the coast of the Sound, where he would bury containers with information written in cipher, written sometimes in invisible ink, that would be a record of what Mr. Townsend had gathered in New York City. Now, to get the information across Long Island Sound, we needed to have a boat. And we had just the guy for it, Caleb Brewster. Mr. Brewster ran a small fleet of whaling ships, whale boats, not ships, but boats. They were small. They would dart back and forth in between British ships and cause all kinds of havoc. Throw firebombs on board ships, do whatever they could to disrupt traffic by the British on Long Island Sound. But Caleb would also be the courier between Connecticut and Long Island. He would run the information from Long Island back to Washington on the Connecticut side. But how did he know when there was information? Well, he would come out to about halfway on Long Island Sound, and he would take out his spyglass, and he would look for one of the other spies in Setauket. Her name was Anna Strong. Talk about in plain sight. Watch this. Now, Anna owned she and her husband owned another small farm right next to Mr. Woodall. Her husband in the colonial army had been captured and was in a British prison camp. She was all alone on her farm, trying to make do with however she could, and she was in the midst of a loyalist village. The village occupants were split between the colonial cause and the crown, but were mostly loyalists. So if they saw anything suspicious going on, they would turn that person in. Well, how was Anna going to get to Caleb Brewster in a boat off the shore a message that there's information to be picked up on the Woodall farm and he should come ashore and he ought to go to one of those particular holes in the ground and get the container? Well, she did it in a very interesting way. She put a clothesline up. Well, it was a regular clothesline, but what she hung on it communicated to Brewster if there was something to be collected and in which hole he should go to find it. First of all, as you can probably see in the picture on the right-hand side, there's the young lady with her laundry line in front of her. Out in the background is Long Island Sound. There's her black slip. If the black slip was on the line, Brewster ought to come in that night and pick up a message. But what hole? Well, he would have to count the number of handkerchiefs that were hanging on that line. If there were 5 handkerchiefs, he would come in and he would go to hole number 5, and the message, the information should be waiting for him then. Okay? The copper ring was probably best known, although their spy work was going on all the time, but they were probably best recognized for their work in stopping General Clinton from moving English troops from the New York area out to Rhode Island when the French army first came to the colonies. They were landing in Rhode Island. The French fleet was off the coast there, and the British knew they were coming ashore. They planned to make an attack upon the British soldiers, but the information from the copper ring told Washington that they were about to move out against the French. That caused Washington to take measures to prevent the English army from descending upon the French in Rhode Island and avoiding a catastrophe and keeping the French active in the colonial turnaround here in the colonies. So that was one. Now the second one that they're best known for has to do with a fellow by the name of Major John Andre, a fort at West Point, New York, and a general by the name of Benedict Arnold. Okay, British spies at West Point. How is this working? What's going on here? The picture that we have here is an old drawing from the fort at West Point looking down the Hudson River. And if you've ever visited West Point or seen pictures or maps of it, it is in a beautiful spot to be protective of the river. The cannons that are in the fort could play havoc with any ships coming up the river. Now, the Hudson River kind of divides New York, as you probably know, from New York City, and the Hudson River runs up north and then it bends west and goes over to Lake Erie or near Lake Erie. Well, that separates New York into really 2 pieces. Washington controlled both sides of the Hudson River past West Point. And West Point was a control feature of that river access. So as long as the Americans controlled West Point, the British couldn't move their shipping up and down the Hudson to play havoc with the colonial troops who were moving back and forth between the northern colonies and the middle colonies, going across the northern end of New York State, or New York Colony, I should say. So if the loss of the fort, the Hudson River becomes an artery for the British Navy, really. So Benedict Arnold was the commander of the fort at West Point. And in just a minute, we'll get to the story of how he got to be the commander. But let's think about Benedict Arnold for just a minute, okay? Benedict Arnold's dad was a businessman. He was a merchant. He was quite good, except he, well, let's hold that for just a second. Let's stay with Benedict for just a minute. Benedict Arnold also was a businessman, following in his dad's footsteps before the Revolutionary War. When the war began, he entered already battle tested from the French and Indian War, okay, and having already been wounded in combat. But he always had trouble with fellow officers because Benedict Arnold had developed a couple of bad habits. Okay, let's take a look at those. His fellow officers used to describe Benedict Arnold as one of those guys who always had his palm out. What did he mean? Well, his dad, who was a Connecticut merchant before he died, was a heavy drinker. And his dad made plenty good money as a merchant, but really couldn't save much of it. He couldn't get Benedict Arnold off to school. So Benedict Arnold went into a 7-year apprenticeship to become a merchant, sort of like his dad's. Maybe without the drinking, but we'll see about that in just a minute. He became a store owner, and as a store owner before the American Revolution, during the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and all that, he became a smuggler because colonial merchants very often had to find ways of beating the taxes so that they could continue to make the profits they were used to, especially on things like sugar, which had to be imported from the West Indies, as did rum. So Benedict Arnold became a part of the smuggler's trade and learned how to live that lifestyle while still being a merchant in Connecticut. Well, when the war, Revolutionary War started, Arnold joined and really turned out to be a great officer, good strategist, very courageous man, always a good leader of men in the field. And a leg wound put him in the hospital for a while, but he came out and was quite well decorated. In fact, when the British left Philadelphia to go to New York City, where they could confront the French more easily and more effectively, the colonists, the colonial army, could pretty much walk into Philadelphia. And when they took over the city of Philadelphia, they made General Washington made Benedict Arnold the commander of the city of Philadelphia. Okay, and here's where this finger in the pie, hand outstretched kind of ideas about Benedict Arnold really took root. Here are two people, Benedict Arnold and Peggy Shippen. Okay, we see Peggy on the right in the picture with a couple of the Arnold children, and we see Arnold on the left-hand side. Now, Benedict Arnold, more than anything, liked to live big. And in Philadelphia, he had a grand opportunity. He was commander of the city. He wandered around the upper class in the city, and Peggy Shippen and her family were a part of that group. But they were also loyalists. Now, when Benedict Arnold met Peggy, he fell in love with her. But here was a colonial army general falling in love with a loyalist woman from loyalist family. But her family was wealthy. He loved that lifestyle, and he loved courting Peggy Shippen. So they were romantically tied, but before Peggy Shippen met Benedict Arnold, about a year before, she also met a young English officer by the name of John Andre. Okay? John Andre was very swashbuckling, very handsome young man, and Peggy and John were probably romantically involved before Benedict Arnold showed up on the scene. So when the English had to pull out from Philadelphia and go back to New York City, John Andre had to leave. And of course, as he left, into the scene came Benedict Arnold. Then things changed pretty quickly. Okay, the fellow Benedict Arnold's fellow officers in Philadelphia really got tired of Arnold's spending and, as they said, stealing. He was stealing money uh, that he would acquire by selling army goods, by selling supplies, and from the sales, taking the money to support his lifestyle in Philadelphia. So the officers finally complained to Washington, and Benedict Arnold was put in front of a court martial in Philadelphia. Well, the court martial found that Arnold was really not guilty. There wasn't enough evidence to strip him of his command, to reduce him in rank, and maybe kick him out of the service. But he was heavily reprimanded by Washington as well as by other officers, and he became intensely angry. And that started the spiral downward that we know of as Benedict Arnold moves from being a loyal colonial officer to a traitor. Well, Washington sent him to West Point. He could not leave him in Philadelphia any longer. So Benedict Arnold went to West Point, and when he got there, still angry as could be, Peggy Shippen, who knew John Andre, the English officer, said, "Look, husband of mine, why don't I put you into contact with Major Andre? Maybe you could get even with these people who are giving you so much trouble, these officer friends of yours and colleagues. This will help you get even. It'll also help you get enough money to get out of debt so that you don't have to worry about selling supplies or anything like that. And in fact, husband of mine, do you need to stay in the colonial army?" Well, all things for Benedict Arnold to think about. So Andre and Arnold met in September 21st, 1780, and they began to exchange maps. Actually, Arnold gave Andre maps of the West Point area. He gave him locations of troop concentrations, of where cannons were located, and also plans for how the fort may be taken by the English. If they could just come up the river, Arnold would show them how to take West Point. When it was time for Andre to go back to New York with all of this information, much of it in cipher, much of it in invisible ink, again, a favorite of spies at that time, and of Peggy Shippen, okay? Some other conspirators convinced Andre that he would have a better chance of getting back through colonial lines to an English ship on the Hudson if he wore plain clothes, if he wore colonial garb, okay? And in fact, they even wrote for him a pass that said that Benedict Arnold was guaranteeing him safe passage back down the river along the Hudson River. But remember the Culper ring? Well, they were at work at the same time. As word started to get around in New York City that there was an agent willing to sell out West Point, the Culper ring got that information and sent it to Washington. Via that line with Anna Strong hanging out her black slip, message, Khalid Brewster grabbing the right container, sailing it across Long Island Sound over to President Washington. The Culper ring was at work. Well, an unhappy ending for Andre. So what happened? On the 23rd of September, Washington, along with some of his other officers, were headed up to West Point to see just what was going on. And they wanted to stop and talk to Benedict Arnold privately before they even got to the fort. So they arranged to have breakfast at Benedict Arnold and Peggy Shippen's home. Okay? When Washington got there, there was no Benedict Arnold to be found. And Peggy Shippen said, I don't know where he went. I don't know where he's at. So Washington and his officers went on to West Point. There they got the information that someone was selling secrets or intended to sell plans and secrets about West Point directly to the English. And Washington wasn't sure who that was yet. Nobody really could put a name on that because Andre, even though he had been captured, hasn't spilled the beans yet. Okay, so now Washington decides to backtrack. He says, let's go back to the home of General Arnold, and let's see if we can get a little more clarification of what's going on here. So they went back to the Benedict Arnold home, and this time Peggy Shippen, now quite clearly a British spy, aiding her husband in this whole treacherous act, Peggy goes crazy. She's running around the house. She's screaming. She's yelling. She's crying. She's falling on the floor. Where's my husband? I don't know what's happened. He's run away. I didn't know. He was a spy. Oh my goodness. She was devastated, but it was all an act, of course. Okay, so Washington took off, headed back towards Connecticut. But before he went, there had to be a trial, and that was the trial of Major John Andre, which is quite well documented in history. Now, John Andre had asked that he be given the rights of a military officer, because that's what he was, but he was in civilian clothing. He was carrying out a spy's work, okay, in plain sight, just like a colonial would look. So Washington said, I'll have none of that. You're going to have to face the court-martial and the trial as a civilian. So Andre said, please, 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 would you at least allow me to wear my British uniform at my trial? No, you cannot. The trial takes place, the court-martial. He's found guilty. He's sentenced to be hung right there and then. At that point, Washington said, you can put your uniform on and you can be hung in your British uniform. And that's what happened. But Benedict Arnold is on his way to New York City, where he's going to join the British Army. And he's going to try to find a place in the British Army in New York City. With all the valuable information he has, he should be quite a valuable asset. Peggy is on her way now, also back to New York, through Philadelphia, where she stops to see her family, and she's back on her way to Philadelphia. Now, how does this story unfold? Well, Benedict Arnold is not very warmly received by the British officers that he has to serve with. They say, well, wait, this guy's a traitor. He sold out his own people. He sold out his officers. Why should we trust this guy? And so things were pretty bleak for the Arnolds in New York City. And then they decided, well, it's not going to work here. Let's go to London. So Benedict Arnold and Peggy Arnold, Peggy Shippen, and their 3 children, I believe, at this point, moved to London, where Peggy does quite well in London society, but Benedict cannot adjust, and they can't adjust to him very well. And eventually, they moved to Canada after the war, where Benedict establishes himself as a small businessman until his death. Well, the Culper Ring was notorious during the Revolutionary War. And if you want to watch on Netflix the series called Turn, T-U-R-N, you'll find that village that we're talking about, Sawtucket, okay, is the focus of most of that series. And they'll even talk a little bit about the Culper Ring during that series. Pretty accurately, too. All right, let's move to another war, why don't we? After the American Revolution, let's go to the Civil War. And we're going to go to both sides during the Civil War because women were at work as spies and in plain sight on both sides of the struggle. First of all, let's visit with the Cleopatra of the succession. Her name is Belle Boyd, and she is quite an eccentric young woman who has one really important charm, and that is that she's charming and she's pretty. Great qualifications for a spy. At the age of 17, in Virginia, in a part of Virginia that becomes West Virginia later on, she winds up with her first opportunity to get in trouble. She is in a town that is being taken over by the Union Army. She's age 17. She's just out of finishing school. And it is rumored that she has a Confederate flag hanging in her bedroom. So some Union soldiers are sent over to get the flag. They get to her house. Nobody really wants to let the soldiers in, but they say, we're going to go in there. And Beth's mother, or Belle's mother, steps in front of the soldiers, says, you can't. This is a private residence. We won't. And they really get into a verbal debate. And the officers call Belle's mom some nasty names. Well, Belle gets all upset, goes in the house, gets her dad's pistol, and shoots one of the soldiers. So now she's just killed a Union soldier. Nobody ever really determined whether it was a flag hanging in her bedroom or not. But in any case, Belle was for the first time arrested. Okay? She was held for a few days. When she got to jail, she had a wonderfully big smile. She was very attractive. She smiled her way through a hearing in which the military officers in charge of the hearing said, oh, I think she probably was pushed too far, this poor, lovely young lady, and I think our soldier probably was at fault. And so she was released, arrested, but let go. Okay? Now, her dad owned a hotel in this town. And Belle decided she was really, really extremely upset with the Union Army at this point. So she would begin to gather a little bit of information. I think that's called spying. So she had the ability to roam around the hotel because it was her dad's hotel, and she knew places where she could listen at thin walls or at knotholes in walls, so she could hear what was going on in the next room. And she would send that information very often with slaves through the Union lines to Confederate, or along the Union lines to Confederate strongholds. And the information turned out to be quite a good information. During the time that she was doing this, she also had, or the town was the object of Stonewall Jackson's raid to turn the town back over to the Confederacy. And she thought this was marvelous. She supplied information to General Jackson. And when he appeared down at the end of the street, she went running down the main street of her town, yelling to him about it's okay to attack. They don't have many soldiers here. Come on in. And as she's doing it, Union soldiers are trying to shoot her. The incident is kind of described in terms of her skirt. Her skirt was full of bullet holes, but she got to General Jackson and told him what the situation was, and Jackson rode into town and took over the town. He and she became instant friends, and instantaneously she became a Confederate spy. Now, she was an official spy, but a charming young lady who could move charmingly amongst Union soldiers, and so she was in plain sight, one of the best places to be if you're a spy. So she moved through Union lines pretty easily, again smiling, again flirting. And every once in a while, she would be stopped, of course, but she could always charm her way out of being held. Arrested probably 6 or 7 times for moving through enemy lines, but always being let go. Now, the way she defended this is she said, I always wanted to help my people. She's talking about the Confederacy. And there were a couple of times she actually did have to spend a little time in jail. One of the times she was put in the old Capitol prison in Washington, D.C. While she was there, and she was only there about a month, she got engaged to another prisoner there, another Southerner, but she was so charming to the prison superintendent that when she was ready to leave and she told the superintendent, look, I'm going to marry that fellow at the end of the war that's here in the prison too, so take care of him, be nice to him. The superintendent gave her a trousseau. So she had gifts to take with her while she was leaving the prison. She was escorted from the prison in D.C. up to Richmond, or down to Richmond, down south to Richmond, by Union soldiers, so she could get safely through the line. And as soon as she got to Richmond, she turned her escorts into the Confederate Army. So she didn't return the favors quite as graciously as she received them. Towards the middle of the war, she decided that she could be helpful running information back and forth between the Southern colonies and England. She would be a courier for the Confederacy and cross the Atlantic via sailing ship to England and then bring information back. It didn't last long. On her first trip, the Union blockade caught the ship. She was, of course, captured by the Union. She was brought about aboard the Union ship. And by the time the Union ship got back to New York City with their prisoner, she had fallen in love with the captain of the Union ship. In fact, they were seen all over New York City, shopping together, dining out, and having a great, great time. They married. They went to England, where the Union officer that she married renounced his allegiance to the Union and spent some time in England with her before he returned to America to be arrested and held for treason. But he was never killed. He was released later on. Now, towards the end of her life, Belle Boyd took on the name Nina Benjamin, and she went on the stage and she told her stories about her time as a spy. She made it well known that she was a spy, and she called herself the Cleopatra of the Shenandoah, or the Succession, I'm sorry. She went all over the Midwest and the North, played to pretty big audiences until she died in the Wisconsin Dells, not far from my old hometown of Chicago. Well, this is not another picture of Belle Boyd. This is Crazy Bette Van Loo. They kind of look together, probably a hairstyle, does it? But in Richmond, Virginia, it's the home of Elizabeth Van Loo, who got the name Crazy Bette. Okay, well, Elizabeth lives in the South. She lives in Virginia. She lives in Richmond. But back in 1843, before 20 years, almost 20 years before the Civil War starts, Elizabeth and her mother freed all of their slaves. And they had pretty extensive slave holdings too. And they bought the freedom of the families of their slaves, quite a change of attitude about slavery, a whole change of heart. Well, one of those slaves would become known later as Little Mary Bowser. Little Mary became quite a good friend with Bette, and Bette sent Little Mary north to go to school. And then After some time in school, Beth sent Mary over to Liberia, which was being formed as a new country in Africa, with a great number of black slaves being sent there to new citizenry in Africa. But Mary, or little Mary, didn't like her stay in Liberia. And so she said, no, I want to go back. And when she came back, she was immediately arrested as a runaway slave. But it didn't take too long for Crazy Beth to get her out of jail. Okay? While little Mary was in Liberia, Crazy Beth was earning her name. She was working at Libby Prison in Richmond. She was working as a, quote, nurse. She would just do whatever was necessary to help the prisoners be comfortable and that sort of stuff. And she got the nickname Crazy Beth so that she could work in plain sight. She became eccentric when she walked into the prison every day. She became a little bit loony. She would mumble to herself. She would say strange things to people. And the people kind of looked at her and said, oh, stay away from her. She's a little bit crazy. We got Crazy Beth right there. Okay? But while she was in prison, she would get, helping the prisoners, she would get information from the northern prisoners or from southern prisoners. No, back it up. I got my prisoners going from one side to the other. While she was in prison, she would bring information in from Confederate soldiers, things she had learned out there in Richmond. She would bring them in and give that information to Union soldiers who were being held captive in Libby prison. Then she and her crew of spies would help them escape, and they would be the couriers then of information about the Confederate troop movements and troop numbers around Northern Virginia. Well, as we talked about earlier, cipher and invisible ink, big part of Van Loo and her crew's modus operandi. They connected with the pro-Union underground in Richmond. They used slaves routinely to gather information about Confederate troops, fed it to the underground, and slaves are in plain sight also, are they not? They move about Richmond, they move about Northern Virginia, because that's where they belong, according to Southern society at that time. But they gather information continually, fed it to Van Loo, and she fed it through her underground back through the northern lines. Secrecy was maintained through the use of ciphers and invisible ink very, very often. Now, this is the one that this crushes me. This is wonderful. Mary, a little Mary that we met before, went to Liberia, came back, so forth. She is a real active part of the spy network. Her real name becomes Little Mary Richard Denham, because she'll marry after the war, and that'll become her actual name. I want you to look at this picture, if you can see it okay. This is a picture of Jefferson Davis and his family in the doorway of their mansion in Richmond. Okay? There's Jeff Davis's wife sitting to his left, daughter, grandchildren, and do you see the slave standing in the background? Yeah, that's little Mary. Little Mary, when she came back from Liberia and Crazy Beth got her out of jail, Beth got her placed in Richmond society, and she became a hit. She had photographic memory, she was smart, she could read, she was great. In fact, society pushed her along, and Beth kind of guided her course so that she would become a part of the household of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. There she is in the household. Every day that she was there, she would clean his office, and of course take an opportunity to read the correspondence on his desk. Photographic memory. She would pass that information back to her boss, Crazy Bet, and the information would go out over the network. Okay. I want to take a look at what we talked about there. So after the war, Crazy Bet, for all the good that she'd done from the 1840s on by buying slaves' freedom and the families, Crazy Bet spent all of her family's money on her spying operation and on just her own survival during those years, to the point where she was destitute by the end of the war. And even though a couple of people appealed to the national government to help her out, help never came. And she died in a wretched lifestyle. Poor, no money. In fact, the headstone for her grave had to be gifted to her by a friend. Now, we're going to move up just a little bit here too, to another woman that I think is just love to hear about her. Her name is Virginia Hall. She has a more lasting name for me. It's the Limping Lady. Virginia Hall will take us up from the Civil War to World War II. She's a Barnard and Radcliffe College graduate, which means she's been well trained in spyware, right? Spycraft. Radcliffe and Barnard, that's what they're known for. Tongue in cheek, right? She had a profound desire for adventure. And when she got out of college, she wanted to get into the Foreign Service. She wanted to live or work in consulates overseas. She wanted to travel Europe, especially. She entered the U.S. Foreign Service, but the best she could do was to become a clerk in some U.S. embassies in Europe. And she said, okay, fine. Well, while she was there, she would wander all over Europe, finding adventure wherever she could. And on one day, she was hunting with friends in Turkey. They were hunting birds. And climbing over a fence, she tripped. As she fell over the fence, her rifle discharged, and she shattered the bottom of her left leg, especially the ankle and the foot. The time in the hospital was spent, of course, in recovery and also in the recovery from an amputation that was necessary. She lost her left leg from the knee down, and she had an artificial wooden leg put on there, and she named it Cuthbert. That was her name for her leg. But she became known as the Limping Lady from there on out. In 1940, when the war was breaking out in France, especially, she joined the French ambulance corps as a driver and carried wounded from the lines back to the hospital. The British Secret Service heard about her adventurous lifestyle and her thirst for adventure, and when the French were pretty much being subdued by the German troops at that time, they asked her or opened the door to her to become part of their Secret Service. And they made her a phony reporter for the New York Post newspaper. And here's the way it worked. Hall would radio news stories to New York City, to the New York Post office in New York City, newspaper office. They would then relay, there, and in her messages would be secret code. So whatever she was learning, okay, whatever she was learning from her contacts back still in France, she was sending to America, to the New York Post. Then responses would be sent back to Britain, encoded messages to newspapers, and then be given back to her. And she would get that information to her French resources. She coordinated jailbreaks in France. She was in charge of sabotage missions. She did rescue activities throughout France, all limping on her artificial leg. Her mission was, as she put it, set Europe ablaze. And that's the way, if you look at the, I love this. This is the next quote on the page is from Klaus Barbie, the Nazi higher up, who was quoted as saying, "I would give anything to get my hands on that limping Canadian." He didn't know she was an American in the service of the English. So he thought she was Canadian, but he was so upset with her activity that what you see on the right-hand side is a wanted poster that was printed by the Nazis in France and circulated all over France, which meant that maybe her profile was getting a little large for staying in France. And so the limping lady, Virginia, decided that she'd better get out of there. And she couldn't get across the channel to England. She couldn't go north or east. There'd be nowhere to go. You'd be going right into the German stronghold. So she decided she'd have to get over the Pyrenees and over into maybe the French, the coast, or over into Portugal or someplace like that. So she trekked 50 miles over the Pyrenees Mountains, and she got herself out of the predicament that she was in. Now the British decided that she was so marked by the Nazis with the posters and the reputation and everything else that she wouldn't really work as a spy any longer. So what did she do? She applied to the CIA and joined the OSS and became a spy for the United States. In 1944, she returned to France, disguised as a 60-year-old peasant woman, in plain sight, right? And she would continue using her radio to send information from France through Britain to the United States. This time, you remember that Anna Strong would hang a black slip on her clothesline to let people know there was information to be exchanged. Well, Virginia did it through a geranium pot on her window. If the geranium plant was put on her window, there was information to be exchanged. And the French underground would come by, they knew what brick in the wall to remove, reach behind it, get the information, and take it off to agents, to the underground for use in sabotage and things of that nature. In her final days in France, she derailed trains, she blew up 4 bridges, and she captured 500 Nazi prisoners. Kind of her crowning achievement in France before the war ended. And the Nazis could never get their hands on her during the war. Now, after the war, she's the only woman to ever receive the Distinguished Service Cross up until that point. And we see her in the picture, that's Wild Bill Donovan, giving her the Distinguished Service Cross in May of 1945. Now, there's some interesting things that continue to be a part of her story. Talk about in plain sight, secrecy, and all that kind of thing. Not until her death did her family learn the full story about her work as a spy. She wanted it to stay undercover. She didn't want anybody to know that. Okay, Bill Donovan talked about that in a quote of his. She was able to play on the chauvinism of the Gestapo. None of the Germans early in the war thought that a woman was capable of being a spy. It's that stereotype of women that I mentioned at the start of our story. Women can't carry out this dangerous stuff. Don't be absurd. We don't have to worry about the women. Well, don't say that to the Limping Lady, that's for sure. Now, on the other side of the, let's say it, on the other side of the Russia, U.S., British side stories as the war concluded, is another spy. This woman that we see in the picture is a spy. She's a spy for the Soviet Union. Her name is Melita Norwood. She was identified in 1997 after stealing British nuclear secrets for more than 40 years. How did she pull that off? Well, by being in plain sight, keeping her eyes open, knowing what she was doing. She began her spy career in the 1930s. Her and her husband were members of the Communist Party. They wanted to see the spread of communism. That was the part of the philosophy. But they also, she had another mission. She became a secretary at the Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association, okay, in London. That's another name for the nuclear industry in London, the nuclear weapons industry, okay? So here she is, a secretary at the agency that's going to be controlling the development of nuclear weapons. But she's a secretary to a higher up in that organization. There she is in plain sight. We can trust her. She's in our office. She's there every day, has coffee with us, has a role. What a wonderful woman. And no one noticed. The longest serving Soviet spy was sitting in that British office for all of those years. Now, of course, she was a member of the Communist Party when her family heard that. Years later, they said, "What? Who, Mom?" They didn't know it. But her, Melita's real fear was of a nuclear monopoly. She thought in her mind it would be better if both Russia and America and Great Britain would have nuclear weapons. That would be a standoff, and nobody would be inclined to use it, especially after the use of the weapons in Japan. So for 40 years, she was opening her boss's mail and his safe and taking pictures and sending those documents off to Moscow. Her employer couldn't prove anything. M15, the British Secret Service, didn't believe women spies were dangerous. Even towards the end of Melita's career, the English Secret Service knew she was a spy. But they said, but she's a woman. How can she really hurt us? How can they hurt, this industry, this spy industry run by all of us are smart men? Well, in 1979, she got an award for Moscow, actually, went there and received it, but she was not turned out by the Secret Service, the English Secret Service, until almost 20 years later. The KGB files were opened in the 1990s, under the cooling down of the Cold War. Her daughters were amazed, only one daughter, was amazed at Mom's her shenanigans. 1997, the London Times published a book review that talked about her story, and it was the first time the English public actually learned about who she was and what she was up to. She was finally exposed completely to the public at the age of 87. There she is walking out the sidewalk of her house to her front yard, where she read a little announcement to the paper, said, if I had to do it again, I would do exactly the same thing. Okay, now I'm going to take you, we're closing out here. I'm going to take you to another kind of spy and another fantastic effort by women in the spy craft. This is the work done by code breakers. The women who worked at Arlington Hall in Virginia or Bletchley Hall Park outside of London. Okay? What was this all about? When World War II opened, the United States and Great Britain both recognized the fact that there was an awful lot of coded information that was being sent through the German Enigma machine, through the Japanese Purple machine, that could not be decoded. And that information controlled the movement of supply ships and warships and everything. They needed to find somebody who could decode all of that information, who could be a spy electronically. And so who did they look for? Well, they began to look for people who were good puzzle workers, who were good rational thinkers, who were imaginative. And they said, who would that be? I bet you that includes an awful lot of women. And so in the United States alone, almost 10,000 women were recruited to come to work at Arlington Hall. That's one of the spots in the Virginia area where the women were housed, where they were put up in offices and given codes to break continually, 8 to 10 hours a day of looking at letter strings, number strings. Why? Because these women showed a propensity to be able to solve crossword puzzles and number puzzles. And many of them were teachers, college graduates who were just looking for employment in some way to help the United States during the war. The codes were horribly complex, especially in the United States, the focus on Japan, where the codes were also in a language that was not really recognizable to many of the people who were beginning this work. So teachers, secretaries at work and at home, all were recruited. Now, here's one of this is very interesting to me. When they came into the service of our Secret Service and to become code breakers, they had to swear that they would not tell anyone what they were doing. It had to stay a secret, okay? And it was a well-kept secret. And the moment a woman who was in this workforce would say, hey, well, tell somebody, and that information got to the government would fire her and send her back home. No, you can't stay. You can't tell anybody what you're doing here, okay? So they were put to work in these offices like we see right here, endlessly every day, working on the breaking of codes. And there were some people put in charge of those. Now, I'm going to show you a picture of a house. That's not a house, it's actually a laboratory, the Riverbank Acoustical Lab. And I want to tell you this little story for about 2 minutes here, because this is my experience with spies in plain sight. This is a personal experience. That building you see was built about 1900 by a fellow by the name of Colonel. He wasn't a colonel, that was a title given to him, George Fabian. Okay, this is in northern Illinois, in Geneva, on the Fox River. Okay, he was a scientist. He followed all kinds of obscure sciences. When he first built this laboratory, he wanted to build a levitation machine that would move things up and levitate them by sound waves. And he was trying to do that. But the other passion he had, he believed that Shakespeare did not read or write his plays. He believed somebody else wrote them. He believed that another Englishman was the guy who actually put together all of Shakespeare's plays. And now as I'm talking, I can't remember his name. Somebody will help us when we get all done. Okay? But Fabian built this place called Riverbank. Now, how is that personal to me? Right across the street, he had also built a beautiful Japanese gardens. And alongside the garden was a bike, or there is today, a bike trail along the Fox River. For 10 years, I commuted by bike along that trail, past his laboratory every day, there and back. to the Illinois Math and Science Academy, where I was opening the school and teaching. And it never, ever dawned on me that this building and this lab could be involved in spy work in any way. Well, wait a minute. You're talking about Shakespeare's plays. Come on, what is that? Well, when Fabian got to looking into Shakespeare's play, he was convinced that there were codes left in the writings of this other English author. And I will get that somewhere. I hope it will jump into mine. That there were codes buried. And so Fabian started hiring some expert code breakers. Francis Bacon. Abby pokes me in the side here and says, look, silly guy, that's the name of that English writer. So Francis Bacon was the fellow who Fabian believed wrote the Shakespearean plays. So Fabian hires code breakers, 2 or 3 experts, and he has them going through Francis Bacon's writings to find code that will lead them to the real manuscripts, the first manuscripts by Shakespeare. Now this is all going on in this building, but way before I'm biking past it, but I never bothered to find out anything about this truly interesting looking building. Well, when 2 of the cipher geniuses that Fabian hired were William and Elizabeth Friedman. Now they weren't married at the time they were at the Fabian Labs. They got married when they both went to Washington to head up departments of that code breaking operation that we were just looking at. Friedman's women, especially, and this is both Elizabeth and William both worked with the same group of women. William tended to be the supervisor on one level, Elizabeth the supervisor on another level. Their women actually broke the Japanese code machine Purple. They figured it out. Just as the English were figuring out the Enigma machine, well, back there in Bletchley Park, we were figuring out the Purple machine. And for quite a while, we knew where ships were going, where supplies were going towards the end of World War II. I don't think there's any spying. Well, that's spying at its best, code breaking. So I had the experience of going past that lab. Abby and I went back to Chicago a couple of weeks ago. We drove up to the lab because one of my sons lives not too far from there. And we wandered around the area, and we also discovered that behind the lab during World War II, there was a big vacant field where Fabian was also experimenting with how's the best way to use hand grenades. And so we decided we probably didn't want to walk across that field in case there were hand grenades still in the turf somewhere or something like that. But right in my backyard, and I never figured it out. Now, I want to give you a couple of sources, and I understood Catherine to say earlier that there will be a lot of information online for you if you'd like to follow up on these stories. But Code Breakers on the right-hand side, written by Liz Munday, is a download from the North Carolina Library. That's one I used back many months ago, putting together a presentation on Code Breakers. And the D-Day Girls by Sarah Rose, and All the Daring of the Soldiers, Elizabeth Leonard's book about Civil War women spies, are all available as downloads or large print or in Braille. So I'm infatuated by women's work as spies. They are no doubt completely and thoroughly involved in the spy business today. Hopefully it's not because of the stereotyped view of women that we held back there some years ago. But that was one of the keys to getting them into the spycraft industry back then. Who would have believed that a woman in plain sight could be such an effective spy? And I'd be happy to take questions or comments from anyone if we can click on.
Thanks, Bill. I think Clint and Sarah will take care of that if they have any questions. Clint or Sarah, can you?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions at this
You're not-
time. We have had a couple of comments. Bob Warren indicated it was Francis Bacon, and also that Elizabeth Friedman was a much better cryptanalyst than her husband. And he mentioned a PBS American Experience documentary about her called The Code Breaker.
Good.
And yeah, Kim Revels just wanted to say great presentation.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly would like to extend an invitation, as was done at the start of the program, to programs that are coming up. The next one, if you look ahead, we'll take a look at what it was like in the Americas, North and South, before the Europeans arrived. And that's a program we've had a lot of fun putting together.
Excuse me, Bill, I think that next one will be about the Nova Scotia money pit.
Oh, goodness gracious, you're right.
And then the one after that is the one about.
All right, we're going to take a little trip up to Nova Scotia and see if there's really anything in that money pit.
Does anybody else have questions? Oh, the next program will be September the 8th.
And it will also be at 1 o'clock, right, Catherine?
Correct, 1 o'clock.
Okay. So yeah, we're getting a lot of comments saying thank you and fascinating presentations. It was interesting. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Let's see, Bob also wanted to note that J. Edgar Hoover took all the credit for the outstanding code breaking that Elizabeth Friedman and her team did against the Nazi U-boat fleet.
Uh-huh.
See, Sherry is raising her hand, so I'll unmute her. All right, Sherry, if you could unmute yourself, then we get to hear your question.
Yes.
Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How about you?
That was a very interesting presentation.
Well, thank you.
I did have one question. You
Sure.
mentioned how the women let the others know that there was information to be picked up.
Yeah.
But how did they know the information had been picked up so they could take down their signs?
You mean such as when Anna Strong would hang her laundry out?
Yes.
Yeah. The fellow whose farm was right next to hers was that Woodall Mr. Woodall. His
Yes.
farm was the one next to hers where those containers were buried. And
Yes.
so he would be sure that, well, the way the system would work is Brewster, when he saw the petticoat, would make sure there was a pickup that night. And,
Okay.
then Woodall would go over that night to check that container and be sure that it was cleared out.
Uh-huh.
And so,
And then he
the
would let
information-
her know.
yeah, so that way everything was cleared out. If there was another bunch of information. Now remember, information is going to travel a little more slowly at that time. So by the time Roe would come back from New York City with his tavern supplies, that was his reason for going back and forth between their town and New York City. By the time he'd get back by wagon, and the messages would be in cipher and decoded and all that sort of stuff, the pickups were probably more often than maybe once a week. And so
Right.
at that point, Woodall could just go down to the coast. He knew where the holes were at. He would check the jar and say, okay, it's been picked up, we're good.
Excuse me, I think we're at our 2:30 mark here. I'm sorry to interrupt. But
Okay.
thank you.
Great.
And I just want to say thanks so much to Bill for this fascinating presentation. Also to Kelly Egan, Aaron Bradford, and Sarah Brackett for creating the resource list. to Rebecca Hyman and the State Library's communications team who helped with the promotions, and to Matt Zaire and Clint Exum for orchestrating the technology for this event. And thank all of you for attending.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.